Hi guys. We all know what React.js is, right? But do you know what React components are? Do you know what React props are? If not, keep watching in order to learn about React components and props in this video. So let's get started. So React components are basically objects that allow developers to split the traditional user interface into multiple independent reusable modules. So it used to be in traditional web pages, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, that it would just be coded in plain HTML. There would be no component structure to it, but modern websites use a component structure. So what I mean by that is that the web page is divided into components. A component is basically an object, and these objects interact with these other objects, also components, to build a web page. So React components are basically divided into two types. First type being class components, and the second type are the functional components. So a class component, which I'll show an example of here, is basically a component like this. So this is the classic way of using React components, and they consist of extending the React.component class. Although class-based components were the norm during the early years of React, they are now being replaced by the newer functional component, and it's basically extending React component and then calling the render method lifecycle hook to return or render this HTML or JSX content into the DOM. Next, I'll show an example of a functional component. So this is a functional component. You can see there's a marked difference in how it's structured when compared to class components. And this is the new way of using components in React. They're basically functions that just return JSX. So this code right here, it's not HTML, it's a React markup language called JSX. It allows the users to combine HTML, JavaScript, and React elements inside its code, inside its syntax. Um, JSX stands for JavaScript XML, and it's, as I said, the unique syntax extension. And it's considered faster and safer and easier than using JavaScript. This is due to a variety of reasons that, including that we can write HTML and JavaScript in it. We can have the ability to convert HTML tags into React elements, and it also uses ES6, which is then used or converted into regular JavaScript at runtime. Note that functional components are essentially stateless. So if I go back to my department class, normally we have a constructor call or method here, and this would define the state for this component in a class-based component. But in a functional component, there's no such thing as a constructor. So it's essentially a stateless component, meaning that they do not adhere to the React component lifecycle. But this is not totally true because we can use the useState React lifecycle hook to explicitly define a state variable. So for example, is logged in is a state variable, and it's initially set to false. But we can use the setter method to change its value to true anytime we wish. So we can say set is logged in true to change the state to true. So we're not doing it in the constructor, we're doing it with this hook, useState. Um, and yeah, so that's basically the two types of components. So you might be asking, what's the upside or what's the benefit of using React components over traditional HTML markup? Some of these reasons include being easier to scale. So Let's assume we need 100 A tags. Um, and with a different ID attached to each A tag in an HTML page. Using static HTML would entail having to create each one of those A tags manually, which is very time consuming. Um, Instead, if we use React components, we can easily render not just A tags, but an entire component that can act as an A tag, um, as shown um, in this method right here. So we can have a link component, and we can have an array containing 100 objects. We can use the map function to map over it. And for each object, we can insert a component that represents the data contained within that object. So that's a really cool feature of React components. It's easier to scale. They're also easier to update. So let's say you need to make a change in an LI tag that's present in multiple sections of a web page. If you're using static HTML, you would have to go like find, and then you would have to go LI, and then you have to go through each instance of that LI tag and then change it manually. Instead, if you use React components, you can have a basically a styled component like this, a styled input, and then you can just change whatever attribute you want here. And this styled component would be applied to wherever it's used. So let's see, let's give an example of where it's used. So this is a style component, search. I'm importing that from styles, and yeah, so we can change it on that styles page, and it'll be automatically updated for each and every style. Basically makes updating a whole lot easier. Also, React components allow for state management. Basically, as you see here, these are called state variables because they control the state of the component. Uh, and basically, that is done using props, which I will cover later on in this video. And this also allows React components to automatically render its elements every time there's a state change without any explicit action needed by the user. So let's say I want to change the state of the search variable. I'll enter a value right here, and then automatically this whole component will be re-rendered because that state was changed. So that's a really cool feature of React. Um, and in comparison to plain HTML and JavaScript, they don't even have a concept of state management, much less implementation. So React is clearly the winner in the state management department. So now let's move on to props. So what are props? So let's see. Here's a diagram showing what props are. So props are really a short form notation for properties, and they're mainly used to transfer data between React components, basically transferring data from a parent component to a child. An important point to mention is that React only encourages passing data unidirectionally, meaning from parent to child only and not from child to parent. Although there are ways to pass data from child to parent components, they're mainly as event emitting data, so it's not state or props, but there are ways to do it. There are hacks that you can find on Stack Overflow if you really wanted to, but this is looked down upon because one of React's core philosophical principles is that unidirectional data flow should be adhered to. So you might be wondering, what's the point of having unidirectional data flow, right? What's the point of doing that? Well, there's several good reasons, such as being able to improve performance. Um, you'll have an easier time debugging applications, and you'll have more control over the data. To elaborate on that last point, having more control over the data means that because the data flows in only one direction, it makes it much more predictable and traceable. This is great for maintainability of the application as new developers will be able to understand the application much faster and easier down the line. Basically, yeah, so right here we have an example of a props that we're passing down to this provider child component. But the child component cannot pass props back to this our index component. Or I'll give a better example, we have element passing down as props this element, and then this route this route component cannot pass props to the app component because that's the parent. So I'll give a simple example of props right here. So you have the parent, and then it's rendering a child. It's passing in this user object state variable as props to the child. The child receives it right here and then accesses the name attribute of this user object and renders it to the DOM. So basically, a very simple concept. Um, a very useful attribute of props is that whenever the parent component state variables change, the updated values for this user.name value is automatically passed to the child component almost instantaneously. For example, I'll give a demonstration of this. So here we have a um, parent component, and then the child component will automatically render the value that's passed into this input field almost instantaneously. And this is done thanks to props in React. So next we'll go over some best practices when using uh, React components and props. As with most software concepts, there are best practices with everything. The first one is going to be destructuring. So destructuring props is a feature originally introduced in ES6, and it gives us the ability to extract multiple properties from objects and assign them to unique variables, all done with a few lines of code. Basically, we're reducing the lines of code. So basically, let's look at this example. We have props being passed, but then it has multiple properties and then nested properties as well. So we have props, placements, ID, placements, website URL, placements, company name, logo. Okay, so this is a class not destructuring that does not destructure its props. As you see, it makes it for a very messy and nested and convoluted way of using props. Instead, if you choose to destructure your props like this, uh, it's much neater. So let's see. So you have props being passed here, and props would be over here uh, declared as this dot props, and then auth. So this would basically be a short form for props.auth. Instead, now you can have the short form notation of auth. This would just be what used to be props auth.token is now just labeled token. And then what used to be placements.id can just be labeled as ID. So as you see here, we have auth ID, token, website URL ID, company logo, company name, company ranking. Everything has been shortened because of this destructuring feature of using React props. So it's highly encouraged that you use destructuring whenever possible. Um, Another best practice is the practice of limiting the number of props passed to components. So although props are a very good and helpful feature, there can arise problems when you pass in too much properties into a component because it makes it very messy and hard to read and hard to maintain that component down the line. Instead, try to limit the number of props passed into a component. My personal rule is no more than five. If you truly do need more props passed in, consider breaking down that big component into smaller components and then dividing the props passed between those two components accordingly, which leads us to the third best practice, which is to keep components very small and specific. So here's a very interesting article. I'll leave a link for it in the description, detailing this best practice. This is an important design of designing components in React because small and specific components are much easier to maintain and understand than large components that encompass a lot of functionality and do a lot of things. Think about from a debugging perspective as well. Would you rather debug a large component with a lot of tangled logic and a lot of hard to read code, or a bunch of small components that clearly do a single thing or a single responsibility if we speak in terms of solid principles? Basically, the latter option or the small components are clearly the superior option. So always remember to keep your components small and specific. Yeah, so that's basically all I wanted to cover. I want to keep this tutorial nice and short so you can extract as much information as possible. Yeah, so this is it for the React components and props video. Stay tuned for my next video where I'll cover React hooks and explain what they are and go into the React lifecycle as well. So thanks again for watching my video. If you found this video helpful, please make sure to like and subscribe. It'll help me a lot. If not, leave constructive criticism or any type of comment in the comment section below. I always look forward to any type of suggestions or criticisms. Anyways, thanks for watching my video, and I hope to see you in my next video. Have a great day, guys.